Ever notice how something small, like spilling a cup of coffee,
Mm.
can just send that inner critic into overdrive?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, where's that even come from?
Right.
So today, we're going to unpack that. We're doing a deep dive on complex PTSD,
Yeah.
and we have a clinical psychologist with us as our expert.
Yeah, happy to be here.
We'll be looking closely at Pete Walker's book, Complex PTSD, From Surviving to Thriving,
Great book.
specifically chapters 9 and 10. And we'll explore, like, the hows and whys behind that inner critic. We all have one,
Yeah, we all know that voice.
the one that seems to show up at the worst times.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's interesting because it's not like we're born with it.
No.
This inner critic
Yeah.
develops.
Yeah. It's learned.
Yeah, especially in environments where maybe we faced danger, neglect, or abuse growing up.
Yeah, it's often rooted in childhood experiences.
So imagine a kid, right, growing up in a home where their emotional needs are just overlooked.
Right. Or even worse, like punished for expressing those needs.
Exactly, punished, yeah. So they learn to adapt, and
Yeah.
they're like, okay, I got to be perfect.
Believing that if they're just good enough,
They'll get that love.
they'll finally earn that love and approval. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's where this whole perfectionism thing comes in.
Right.
It's like a defense.
It's a defense mechanism.
Walker calls it an instinctual defense
Yeah.
for kids dealing with emotional neglect.
Makes sense, right? Because if you can't get your needs met directly,
You got to find a way.
you got to find some other way, yeah.
And when that doesn't work out,
Which, let's face it, it never really can.
yeah, the inner critic is like, aha, gotcha.
Exactly, and it comes armed with all these attacks.
And Walker breaks those down, right, into two main categories.
He does perfectionism attacks
Okay.
and endangerment attacks.
So give us an example of a perfectionism attack. Like, say you mess up at work.
Oh, okay. So let's say you miss a deadline.
Stressful.
A perfectionism attack might sound like, see, you always mess things up. You're a total failure.
Ugh, brutal. It's never just, oh, I made a mistake.
No, never. It's always way bigger for the inner critic.
It's like it magnifies everything.
Absolutely. Blows things out of proportion and minimizes any accomplishment.
And then you've got the endangerment attacks, which Walker calls,
The horror movie producer of our minds.
which, I mean, that's accurate.
Right. It fits.
Because suddenly it's not just a missed deadline.
it's a whole dramatic scene.
It's like your inner critic watched too many disaster movies.
Exactly. Always scanning for threats, even if they're not really there.
So missing that deadline means you're definitely getting fired.
Ah, 100%.
And then your life is over.
It's a slippery slope to disaster.
It's exhausting.
Totally. And it keeps your nervous system on edge all the time.
Like constantly in fight or flight mode.
Exactly.
Even when there's no real danger.
Right. Just the perceived threat from the inner critic is enough.
What really struck me while reading this was Walker's point about the inner critic actually being our parents' voices.
Oh, that's huge.
Or at least like our interpretation of them, you know?
Yeah, like stuck in our subconscious.
Like it's their voice stuck on repeat in our heads.
It's like that superego gone bad, as he puts it.
Right. It's like we internalize all their rules and expectations.
Even the unhealthy ones.
Yeah. And then we spend our lives trying to please these voices that aren't even around anymore.
And we don't even realize we're doing it half the time.
It's wild, right? We're still trying to earn their approval, even though they might not even be in our lives anymore.
Yeah, it's like we're carrying them with us.
Exactly. And Walker says it's not even just repeating their words. The inner critic gets creative.
Oh, yeah. He calls it an ever-developing process, right?
Yeah.
Like it takes those early criticisms and finds new and improved ways to use them against us.
It's both fascinating and kind of terrifying at the same time.
I know, right?
He gave that example of his client who realized his inner critic was super harsh and used a lot of swearing.
Oh, wow.
But his mom never swore.
Interesting. So the content was different.
Yeah, but the tone, the intention behind it.
It was all too familiar, like a
Exactly.
twisted remix of those early experiences.
And it's like a vicious cycle, right? Early trauma creates this hypercritical inner voice,
Right. Always looking for flaws and dangers.
which keeps us on high alert, more vulnerable to those negative voices.
And then we're more likely to interpret things negatively, confirming those beliefs.
It just keeps going and going.
A self-perpetuating cycle. It's tough to break free from.
So how do we even start to dismantle something so deeply ingrained?
Well, Walker suggests it starts with a pretty simple but profound understanding. We are not our thoughts.
Okay.
We have the power to observe our thoughts, to decide if they're even true, and to choose which ones we want to believe.
That makes sense, but how do we actually do that?
It takes practice. Mindfulness is a big one.
Right, but like how do you go from feeling totally powerless to, like, actually having some control over this inner critic.
One of the tools Walker suggests might surprise you. Anger. Anger. That doesn't seem like the most intuitive approach, right?
Right, it seems counterintuitive. Yeah.
Like, when I think about dealing with my inner critic, I'm usually thinking about self-compassion,
Yeah, being kind to yourself.
positive self-talk, all that good stuff. So how does anger even fit in here?
Well, it's not about getting angry at ourselves.
Okay, good, because that's what the inner critic wants us to do, right?
Exactly. That just fuels the fire. This is about redirecting that anger. So instead of blaming
So
ourselves,
get angry at the inner critic itself.
exactly, it's about recognizing that that voice, that negative voice,
Mm,
it's not who we really are. It's like,
an unwelcome guest.
yeah, or even like a bully that's been allowed to hang around for too long,
Oh, I like that. Like, we don't have to give it power.
Exactly. Walker talks about telling it no or stop
Yeah.
when it starts in with its attacks. Like you're putting your foot down.
It's like we're taking back control.
Right, you're evicting that noisy tenant from your mind.
I love that visual. It helps to create that separation, right?
Right.
Recognizing that those thoughts, they're not us.
It's not our true selves talking.
Exactly. We can choose not to engage with that negativity. We can create a more, I don't know, a more supportive inner world.
Okay, and that's probably where the self-compassion comes in then, right?
Absolutely, because
Yeah.
that inner critic, it thrives on shame.
Yeah, it keeps us small.
So self-compassion is the antidote.
But self-compassion, that doesn't mean just like making excuses for ourselves.
No, it's not about letting ourselves off the hook or pretending our struggles don't matter. It's more about recognizing.
That we're human.
Yes, we're human, we're imperfect, we're allowed to make mistakes and still be worthy of love and acceptance.
Which, let's be honest, that's a tough one for a lot of us.
It is, especially if we've internalized that message that we're not good enough as we are.
We've been told that for so long.
Exactly. So this is about unlearning those messages.
Giving ourselves permission to be human.
Yes. It's
Yeah.
like you're cutting off the inner critic's food supply, right? It needs that shame to survive.
Starve the beast.
Exactly. And as it weakens, it creates space for a more compassionate inner dialogue. We start treating ourselves with the same kindness we'd offer, I don't know, a good friend.
Which is so important and yet so hard to do sometimes.
It's true. But the more we practice, the more natural it becomes.
So we've talked about the inner critic. What about this outer critic Walker mentions? How does that play into all this, especially with CPTSD?
Oh, that's a great point. It's like the flip side of the same coin.
Yeah.
So with the inner critic, we're directing those negative judgments inward.
Right, at ourselves.
The outer critic is when we project those same judgments outward onto other people.
So instead of I'm not good enough, it's,
They're not good enough, or everyone's out to get me.
oh, I see, like that distrust, that suspicion,
Exactly. And again, it goes back to those early experiences of trauma.
where trust was broken.
Right. So now we're on high alert, seeing potential threats everywhere, even when they're not really there.
Which obviously makes relationships really difficult.
Absolutely. It creates a barrier to connection. But just like with the inner critic, mindfulness can help us become aware of these patterns.
So we can catch ourselves in those moments.
Exactly. Recognizing when those thoughts are coming from a place of fear and then choosing to respond differently.
So in a way, it's about learning to trust again.
Yeah. Trusting ourselves, trusting others, trusting that the world maybe isn't always out to get us.
That's a big one for sure.
It is. It's about healing those old wounds so we can open ourselves up to healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
I'm curious, does Walker talk about using anger with the outer critic too? Because it seems like, wouldn't getting angry at others just make those patterns worse?
That's a really important distinction. It's not about directing anger at others. It's about reclaiming our anger, about how we've been hurt or mistreated, both in the past and the present.
So it's more about setting boundaries.
Yes, it's about recognizing that we have a right to protect ourselves, to say no to anything that violates our sense of safety and well-being.
So it's healthy assertiveness, not aggression.
Exactly. Walker talks about redirecting anger away from both ourselves and those we're in conflict with. It's not about blaming.
Then what is it about?
It's about reclaiming our power, refusing to be victims of our past or present circumstances. It's about saying, this is not okay, and I'm not going to tolerate it anymore.
Wow, that's powerful. So where does forgiveness fit into all this? Because that comes up a lot when we talk about healing from trauma, but it's such a loaded word,
Yeah, it definitely can be.
What's Walker's take on it?
Well, he's very clear that forgiveness in this context doesn't mean condoning or excusing abusive behavior. It's not about letting anyone off the hook for the harm they've caused.
So it's not about saying, oh, it's okay, you hurt me or whatever.
No, it's much deeper than that.
So what is it about then?
It's about recognizing that we can't change what happened, but we can choose how we move forward.
I see. It's more about us than them then.
In a way, yes. It's about choosing to focus on our own healing, our own well-being, instead of remaining stuck in those cycles of resentment and blame.
And sometimes that might mean setting boundaries.
Absolutely. And sometimes it might even mean walking away from relationships that are no longer serving us.
Even if those relationships are with our parents.
Even then, it's a difficult thing to do, but sometimes it's the healthiest choice.
That's a tough one. But I guess it's about putting ourselves first, right?
Exactly. Prioritizing our own well-being, creating a life that feels safe, supportive, and fulfilling. And that includes nurturing healthy relationships with ourselves and others.
And those relationships have to be based on respect, on trust.
Absolutely. Mutual respect, trust, understanding, those are the foundations of healthy connections.
Makes you wonder, like, what if everyone had the tools to heal from trauma?
Right. Imagine the world we could create if everyone had the skills to cultivate compassion, self-acceptance, healthy boundaries.
It's a beautiful thought, isn't it?
It is. And the amazing thing is, those tools are out there. That's what's so inspiring about Walker's work. He offers a roadmap, a way forward.
And it all starts with awareness.
Exactly. Awareness of our inner critic, our outer critic, how trauma has shaped us. And then from that awareness, we can start to make different choices.
We can challenge those old patterns.
We can create a more loving and compassionate relationship with ourselves and the world around us.
You know, it reminds me of that quote by Maya Angelou, when you know better, you do better.
I love that quote. It's so true.
It's like this work, this healing, it's an ongoing process, right?
It is. It's a journey, not a destination.
And every step we take towards self-awareness, towards self-compassion, that's a step in the right direction.
Absolutely.
And it's important to remember, we don't have to do this alone.
That's such a crucial point. There's help available. There are people who understand. There is hope. Always remember that. There's always hope.
It's amazing how we've gone from like breaking down this inner critic to, wow, there's actually so much hope here.
It's true. When you're stuck in that cycle of shame and self-criticism, it can be hard to see a way out.
Right. Like, is it even possible to change those patterns?
It absolutely is. Our brains are incredible, you know? They're wired for growth and change, even after trauma.
So even if it feels like those negative thoughts are like permanently etched into our brains.
There's still hope.
Yeah. Walker talks about neuroplasticity, which basically means
Our brains can create new pathways, new connections.
throughout our entire lives,
It's never too late to change.
which is huge. Because if that's true, then all the things we've been talking about, mindfulness, self-compassion, even anger, those aren't just like nice ideas.
They're tools, powerful tools that can literally rewire our brains.
It's like we're training our brains to respond differently.
Exactly. Every time you challenge a negative thought, every time you choose kindness over criticism, you're strengthening those new pathways.
Wow. It makes healing feel a lot more, I don't know, tangible, I guess.
It's not just some abstract concept, it's an actual physical process happening in our brains and bodies.
It's pretty amazing when you think about it that way.
Yeah.
So the more we practice these things,
The easier it
it
gets.
becomes more automatic.
Think of it like working out a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
I like that. So we don't have to wait until we feel like ready or whatever to start taking care of ourselves.
Exactly. There's no need to wait for permission.
You can just start right now, like today.
With any small act of self-compassion, any boundary you can set, it all makes a difference.
And that brings up another point Walker emphasizes, self-care.
Especially for people with CPTSD. Self-care isn't a luxury.
It's not selfish,
It's essential.
because when we've gone through trauma, our nervous systems are often on overdrive, right?
Yeah, like stuck in that fight or flight mode we were talking about earlier.
So we need to find ways to calm down, to regulate ourselves,
To feel safe in our own bodies.
which might look different for everyone, right?
Of course. What works for one person might not work for another.
It could be meditation, being in nature, listening to music.
Whatever helps you feel grounded and connected.
The important thing is to find what works for you and make it a priority.
Make it a non-negotiable part of your routine.
And remember, self-care. It's not just about us.
It impacts everyone around us, too.
When we take care of ourselves, we show up better in our relationships. So I think that's about all the time we have for today.
Okay.
Anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
Just listening to you talk about all this, I keep thinking about how much courage it takes to embark on this journey of healing from trauma. It's not easy,
It's definitely challenging.
but it's so worth it.
It is. The rewards are incredible.
To be able to quiet that inner critic, to learn to truly love and accept yourself, to show up in the world as your authentic self, that's powerful stuff.
It really is. And to anyone listening who's on that journey, just know you're not alone.
There are resources, there's support, there's hope. Never give up hope.
Beautifully said. And remember, every step you take toward healing, every act of self-compassion, no matter how small, it's a victory. Celebrate those victories.
Yes, celebrate them.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. We hope you found it helpful, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon.
Thanks for having me. It's been great chatting with you.